Hi, thanks for being here today. So I'm Katja. You can just pretend that J is a Y. That makes it easier for the pronunciation. Originally, I'm from Germany. I grew up on a farm, dairy farm in East Germany, so we're about 3 hours south of Berlin. But I've been here for about 15 years. I got my master's degree, then my PhD here. So I actually have been, actually graduated 3 years ago, is that right? So yeah, I'm now a research assistant professor at UNL in the agronomy department, University of Nebraska Lincoln. And yeah, I've been very fortunate to receive some funding from OCIA to do some research. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. First, a brief introduction on organic research at UNL. Joel had a great talk about their really, really nice program. I wish we had something like that. We started out in 2006 certifying land for organic studies at our research farms. So there were, I think there were 2 USDA grants that funded this. We used to establish organic certified fields at 4 research stations across Nebraska. We had 2 in the eastern part where we still get about 28 inches of rainfall. Then there's 1 in south central Nebraska in the Central Great Plains that was an irrigated site. And then we also had 1 out in the Western High Plains. And there was a total of 120 acres. And you're noticing all of this, what I'm saying is in the past. So, but I'll talk a little bit more about this later. A whole bunch of topics that people researched on these. A lot of it had to do with nutrient management. There's 1 study still ongoing, a long-term rotation study with Dr. Chuck Francis. I don't know if any of you have heard of Chuck Francis, but he's really been a pioneer in organic and sustainable ecological farming research. So we're fortunate to have him. There's some other interesting topics that people researched. One of my colleagues, Dr. John Quinn, he was also, his advisor was also Dr. Jim Brandl, he was my advisor as well. He came up with the Healthy Farm Index, so he looked at a whole bunch of parameters, what makes a farm a healthy farm, and it included habitat for birds and wildlife and all this stuff. As I said, lots of nutrient management, some organic small grains breeding. That was mainly Dr. Bensinger's research. I did my PhD studies there, looking at clovers as a green manure. And there was also a fair amount of weed management, especially using flaming. Dr. Kniezewicz is one of our researchers. He put on quite a few field days and so on, so that was, and I think he's still doing that, the flaming research, so. Okay, the farm where we had our research is at Mead. So Mead is where currently the largest UNL research station, I would say, is at Mead. So there's I don't exactly know, 5,000 to 10,000 acres or something like this, but most of it is not used for research. Most of it is just used for bulk farming. But then a lot of departments at the university have certain areas set aside. And I did my research at this farm. It's the Mead Forestry Farm. When you look at the picture, and I hope you can see that, what do you notice on this picture? Something that was kind of like the trend to prevent. Like this was one of the first things that people did to prevent soil erosion. What do you notice here? Windbreaks, yeah. It's a forestry farm. It's a windbreak research farm. So it's a really unique site. The windbreaks were established in the 1960s and 1980s. Originally, they were all established in kind of a tic-tac pattern, but many of them were some of them were taken out. But the idea was to look at all the directions that the wind could possibly be blowing, and then you could look at how the crops did. So anyways, it's a beautiful, beautiful farm. And this is where we had the organic site, which is these 40 acres here, right here. So I blew them up a little bit here. So this would be the organic site. And then this is the field where I did my research with cover crops, but I'll get to that. So these fields have been in a long-term, 30 plus years or so, soybean, winter wheat, corn rotation, and there was always manure applied after the winter wheat. So these are fairly productive fields, basically no slope, maybe a 2% slope. The U10 silty clay loam soils. And in the organic sites, there's always disking and field cultivation before corn and soybean, but we usually no-till drill the wheat into soybean stubble. We haven't plowed in a long time, I believe. And then as far as weed control, it's typically cultivation and rotary hoeing after corn and soybean planting. So the first few years after we established this, maybe the first 6 or 8 years, the fields looked pretty good. We had the weeds pretty well under control. We had pretty good yields. There were still people doing research out there, so it was, when there were weed problems coming up, like during the summer, if we had to walk the fields, we usually had enough people. We could organize people to come out and walk the fields and do things like that. But slowly over time, that changed. So the weed pressure has been building up continuously on our farm. And then we had a couple of wet springs. I believe 2015 was pretty wet, 2016. So that made it even more difficult to go in and do timely weed control. So basically, we're adding to our weed seed bank, and it's basically out of control. So, So from that, we were starting to think, okay, maybe we could turn this into a research project, right? We're always thinking about that. How could we, turn this into some sort of research? And I'm doing most of my work with cover crops in conventional corn soybean systems. So most of my work is done with that. So I'm thinking, okay, why can't we use, let's use some cover crops for weed control in the organic soybeans. Can we use cover crops to suppress weeds compared to standard weed control? And then we also wanted to know what are the effects of those cover crop species if you use different termination methods to terminate the cover crops. And then, of course, do they affect soybean yields? Because in our conventional systems, in about half of the site years, we see that cover crops actually reduce soybean yields. So I just want to remind you, this is research, so it doesn't always turn out the way we want it to. But we need to stick to a predetermined protocol. So we can't really change things as much as you can on your farms. We just have to stick with it. Okay, so we started in 2017. That was the first year we received funding from the OCIA. We established our plots here in this field. We decided to go with cool season cover crops, and we decided to establish them early in the spring instead of in the fall. So these are all cool season cover crops. We used small grains, oats, and barley. And then we used brassicas, yellow mustard and brown mustard. The reason we went with those ones is they produce quite a bit of biomass and they grow early in the year. So even at pretty low temperatures, they start growing. We used 2 methods to determine to kill them. Either we disked. We did that only in the first year, we didn't like that. Or we undercut, and that's what we did in the first year, and then in the second year we also decided to terminate all our cover crops by undercutting them with a sweep plow. And then the weed control that was applied was we actually basically did no weed control in the cover crop plots. And then we also had a plot that didn't have cover crops and received no weed control. So I was working with some weed ecologists, and they told me this is the way to do it. So it's actually called a weedy control plot. But basically there's no weed control. So I call this a no cover, no control plot. And then we had a plot that basically mimics what we normally do, which is no cover crops and standard weed control, 2 or 3 cultivations. So these were our 6 treatments. The field was previously in corn, had a high existing weed pressure across the whole field, okay? And it was cultivated in disc before we planted. This is what our plots looked like in the spring. So this is a factorial treatment design, so we combine the termination method and the cover crop species, so there was a total of 12 plots, replicated 4 times. So altogether we had 48 plots. And the plots were 20 by 40 foot wide. And I like this picture. It's amazing. You don't even see it on the ground when you walk through, but these cover crops all had different colors. So the dark blue, or the blue-green, I guess, dark green, this is the oats. This is what the oat looked like. This is the other dark green one, but it didn't really have the bluish tint, was the barley. And then those 2 here in the front were the mustards. And I have plenty more pictures. So year 1 was actually great in the spring. We had enough moisture. We could get in there relatively early, so the cover crops looked really good. This is oats on the left here and barley on the right. The yellow mustard, the mustards really took off. They were taller than the oats, so they looked pretty good. And the field in the cover crops was pretty clean. You can see some tiny weeds down here, but really there weren't any weeds growing in the cover crops. So while the cover crops were growing, they did a really good job at suppressing weeds, at least that first year. And this is what it looked like without cover crops. So this would be our weedy control. Yes, it is weedy. Mostly pennygrass, so we did no weed control whatsoever. And then next to it is our no cover crop standard weed control. So that looked pretty clean. There's definitely differences in the height of the cover crops. These would be all the weeds. Here's the oats, and here's the yellow mustard. And what I like by looking at this, and I'm going to show you the numbers too, but you can actually tell that, or see that actually the cover crops do a lot better than the weeds, even where the weeds, where we do nothing to kill the weeds. So that's kind of cool. I mean, sometimes we talk among us researchers, okay, just keep that in perspective, but some of the researchers say, well, why do you want to grow a cover crop? You can just grow weeds, just let the weeds grow, right, in a conventional system. Well, this would actually be a reason to say, no, actually, why? The cover crops do a lot better than the weeds. And there's lots of other reasons I realize that why you wouldn't want to grow weeds, but okay. So there were also developmental differences. Again, this is taken in late May, right before we killed the cover crops. So the yellow mustard actually started flowering, and the oats and the barley, they were jointing. And the brown mustard had just very few flowers. Okay, so in May, we came in and we measured biomass. And what we found is, even though the brassicas looked taller, the oats had more biomass. The oats were planted at a pretty high seeding rate, so it was probably not too surprising, but overall, these are all relatively similar, between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. And then the red bars over here, so the blue bars is the cover crop biomass, and the red bars is the weed biomass. So there's barely any weeds growing in the cover crops, but there are weeds growing in where we didn't kill them, obviously. We had quite a few weeds. Okay. Well, what happened next? We planted the soybeans, I think June 2nd, so about a week afterwards. And I don't know, they didn't look good. The soybeans, especially after the oats, they were not happy. These are oats that had been terminated with the undercutter, so we can still see that residue, so it has a lasting effect. It suppressed weeds through up until mid-July, but the soybeans, it also suppressed the soybeans. So this is after barley, looked a little bit better. And this is after the mustards. And the mustards, Yeah?
How did you say you terminated the oats back on that previous?
On this picture, we terminated them with a sweep plow, undercut them with a sweep plow, yes. So yeah, please feel free to ask me questions that you have, because we can definitely talk about all of this. So this is after the brassicas. Even though they were pretty tall, we had quite a bit of biomass, that brassica residue decomposed really quickly. And the weeds started growing. But the soybeans, I think they looked a lot better than whatever oats. So, and I really don't have a good explanation for that. And if you have one, please let me know, because I want to figure out what is going on. This is the soybeans where we actually managed weeds, but we didn't do too good of a job. We couldn't get into the cover crops or into the soybeans, you know, at the end of June anymore. So unfortunately, we had quite a few weeds there too. We came in July and measured wheat biomass again. As I mentioned, the oats and the barley, they continuously suppressed weeds. Relatively few weeds, but also not very many soybeans growing there. And then there were actually no differences here in that wheat biomass between the cover crops, the brassica cover crops, or where we had no cover crops and no weeds. So that's kind of interesting. So those, I guess what I found is that the weed suppressing effect is there at first, but it doesn't last very long. And by mid-July, basically all of these treatments here had the same amount of wheat biomass. Okay, and it also didn't matter whether we killed it with an undercutter or with the sweep plow or with a disc. Okay. In the whole field, not just in my plots, the whole field had really high weed pressure, so the soybean was actually not harvested, they just mowed it. And so I could not take any soybean yields. Okay, moving on to year 2, which was 2018, spring of 2018. I'm sure everybody remembers it was a super cold, super long, cold, and dry spring. So that delayed cover crop planting. We planted on April 2nd, but then it really wasn't until April 16th that the average daily temperatures were actually above freezing on most days. So basically, they only had between April 16 and April 23 is when we killed them. So just about 6 weeks. The brassicas again looked pretty good, but our small grains, our oats and barley, they just didn't take off. There were so many weeds that are growing already, which you can see here. It's just lamb's quarters growing everywhere. So they were not able to compete in that year with the weeds. And this is a plot without the cover crop. Yeah, lots of weeds, lots of weeds. Again, we came in May, at the end of May, right before we killed the cover crops and measured cover crop biomass. The blue bars, again, is cover crop biomass. And the red bars is weeds. What can you see on this graph? Do you see anything? It's very depressing. More weeds than anything else, really, except maybe in the mustard. So we didn't, there was just not enough time for the cover crops to grow, and the weeds had already taken, hold of the field. So yeah, it did not work out. However, this bar here, this is about 900 to 1,200, and this was about actually the same amount of weeds that we had the previous year in those plots. So there wasn't necessarily more weeds in the field than the previous year. It was just the cover crops didn't get enough growing degree days to really do anything. Okay. Then we came back in July to again look at cover crop or wheat biomass. So we killed the cover crops I think we killed them May 24th. We planted soybean. I believe we planted on the 25th. Oh yeah, actually it has it on there. Planted on the 24th. We had a lot of rain the 25th and the 30th. So couldn't really do a whole lot of weed control there. And again, the weed pressure was high. This is actually a picture of the plot where we did our standard weed control. The rows look okay, the inner rows look not so good. And the soybeans were completely overgrown. They were completely overgrown in all of the cover crop plots. So it was a sad picture. Again, this is wheat biomass. Yeah, I mean, the field was full of weeds. There was nothing else growing, except this is the only one where we didn't have a lot, and this is where we controlled the weeds. I thought, when I looked at it, I thought, well, they're going to come in again and just mow the whole field. So I better go and try to figure out some way of assessing soybean growth. So I went and took soybean biomass as well. And unsurprisingly, everywhere where we had a lot of weeds, we had no soybeans. And here we had about 1,200 pounds of dry matter of soybeans. So the one thing I want to, maybe if you want to remember one number, this is about, okay, so this soybean biomass, if you compare to this one, this is about 37% of this biomass. So only about a third. So the soybeans that were growing cover crop plots had only about a third of the biomass as the ones that were growing where there was regular weed control. And then what happened next? They didn't mow the field, but what did they do? Look at the picture. Take a wild guess. What happened? The soybeans now, the weeds are dead. They came in and sprayed it with Roundup. So this ended the organic history at that farm. It was a decision that had been predetermined. They'd known it for a year or so. The only reason they didn't do it sooner was because I still had the plots there. But that summer they came in and they said, we're spraying it. So it's kind of sad. It's really sad. I was very disappointed. But we're trying to turn it into something positive. And what happened? I mean, this is research, right? So the soybeans kind of recovered amazingly. This would be on the right side of this yellow flag here would be soybeans that had been grown where we had regular weed control. And these were the soybeans where we had no regular weed control, where there was basically only weeds. So they sort of kind of made a comeback, a little bit at least. We were able to get yield of it. So in the fall, this is just soybean grain adjusted to 13% moisture. Where we had our standard weed control, we had 48 bushels per acre. I mean, it was okay. And the other plots, surprisingly, had about 30 bushels per acre on average, I think. So the soybean did somewhat close that yield gap, because if you remember when I showed you the biomass, it was only a third of where we had controlled the weeds. Here, now, it was about half of this. So, they kind of were able to come back a little bit. I just looked at some of the costs briefly. And this is just a partial budget, so I didn't account for labor or soybean seed or anything like that, but just the seed cost or the costs that are different. So it's hard to see. I'm just realizing this is really hard to see. Unsurprisingly, where we had our highest yield, where we controlled the weeds, we also had our highest income per acre. And this is also, again, a little bit counterintuitive. Where we had the cover crops, we had the lowest income. Where we did absolutely nothing, we had the intermediate income. So anyways, it's research. So people may say, okay, well, this totally, didn't work out the way we wanted it to be, but let's put it in perspective and, remember cover crops also have a lot of other benefits, What's really important for us in Nebraska, and I know it's in the rest of Midwest, actually Iowa has even more problems than we do with nitrate in the groundwater. So cover crops, having a spring cover crop there that's productive, that's really going to help prevent some of that nitrate leaching and help close those nutrient cycles. Cover crops improve aggregation and reduce erosion potential. They benefit soil microbes in early spring. We've done some of the research in our conventional systems. We went and measured the biomass and the different groups that were there this spring. And this spring we had, in our rye cover crop plots, we had only about this much top growth. And even there we saw about 20% increased microbial biomass. So that's positive. And the other thing that I kind of like to remember or keep that in mind, flowering cover crops like our brassicas, they also provide food for a food source for pollinators, and that's becoming important in our agricultural landscapes. Okay, and this is already the end of my talk, so for my take-home message, spring sown cover crops, the productivity varies from year to year, so it's probably not a super reliable tool. They can suppress weeds if they have high biomass. And it lasts, the weed suppression lasts for at least a few weeks, but only for the small grains. The brassicas decompose just too quickly. Definitely have to combine it with some other forms of weed control. So what we did was kind of like what you shouldn't do. We saw those yield reductions after small grains. It's hard for me to, I really don't know why that happened, but we do see it and sometimes in our conventional plots as well. And the other thing is, if you have a field that's so terrible, maybe if you can find a crew of teenagers, I know that would be really hard because nobody wants to work out in a soybean field in the middle of July, but if you can get them to go in there and help weed or something, it could be actually really beneficial. So you could somewhat save some of your yields. I'd like to thank my team. I'd like to thank OCIA for sponsoring us for the last 2 years. It's been a really fun study. It's been lots of people that were involved with this. And with that, I take questions. Yeah. Those were Roundup Ready soybeans, yeah. But only this year. Before, it was all organic. Yeah.
What method do you use to measure the biomass pounds per acre?
Yeah, okay, so we go in, we have a square, we have a 5 square foot frame that we put on the ground. We clip everything above ground, put it in bags, take it in a dryer, dry it, weigh it. Yeah, so that's pretty standard, yeah. Other questions?
With those fields coming off of conventional, like you have, GIM certified,
Mm-hmm.
do you believe that it takes a while for the soils to balance back out? You're going to have these weed pressures until you get the soil profile balanced back out? Because weeds are a way of nature, like purifying the soil, get it balanced.
Yeah.
You're using high NP and K
Uh-huh.
on that soil for years and doing your research.
Yeah.
You consider any of that, that you work those weeds down maybe for 3 years before you turn around and destroy your organic production?
I know.
I'm just curious, if you have
Yeah.
producers,
Yeah.
we're seeing this.
Yeah.
It seems like once the soil gets balanced, the nutrients,
Mhm.
the weed pressure changes,
Mhm.
of course. You have weeds, but it
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah.
What's you have learned, it
Yeah.
seems like that's nature's way of balancing the soils out.
Right.
Not balancing your
Yeah. Yeah.
profile.
Yeah. I hadn't considered that, but the soils are pretty high I mean, they've got so much manure over the years, so they're pretty high in some of the macronutrients. That would have been a possibility, I think, also using more cover crops more consistently would have, and just getting in there more on a timely manner, like Joel talked about it a lot today. That would have been.
That comes to mind is when you're thinking about other recruit, you'll see that happen real quick.
Yeah.
Probably the first deals that you do convert
Yeah.
over. It's something to do with what's in your soil
Yeah.
from conventional. That's something will go crazy. It's not like it's bad breathing dirt or back in the ground.
No.
I would expect a lot of production out of it.
Yeah.
So that's just something for
Sure. Yeah.
to take into consideration. I hate to see it throw the idea away.
I know.
We're all searching for new ways of.
Yeah.
And it's tough for us. We learned the hard way.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your comment. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.